we would just go out through these rear doors where you can see the evacuation signs and assemble out there, and a staff member would assist us to move on to the assembly point. And of course the facilities are just outside and off to the left. If you want to get up at all during the session, that's fine. So just to give you a bit of a sense of what the program is all about and what it hopes to achieve, I've got a small video to start. Thank you.
Better Work Tasmania is an innovative, collaborative approach to supporting and improving work health and safety in Tasmania. In 2007, following a review of work health and safety legislation, the WorkSafe Tasmania Board recommended that a mechanism to reinvigorate work health and safety in Tasmania be developed. 18 months of broad community consultation followed, where over 3,000 employers and workers from businesses and organisations, large and small, were asked what they thought was needed to reinvigorate the WH.
Mentors, that sort of evolved more into site visit type thing and peer-to-peer learning over the time, and that's how people seem to prefer that sort of learning, so that's what we'll carry on with. And we also record these sessions as we are today, and we live stream them, and then the recordings are put up on the website. So again, if you become a member, you'll be able to watch the session today ongoing from here, and also show your work colleagues. We also, as indicated in the video, we have an online induction training program. We've had about over 1,000 people complete the certificates for that online training. So again, you're welcome, once you become a member, to have a look at that online induction training. So we hope to continue growing the membership, so please get on after the session. We have you'll see a small card on the table that will give you information about joining and where to look for that. Continue to develop peer support and also the site visit type facility in order to support people to learn from each other in terms of work health and safety, and webinars that we have done in the past as well. So there's the website. This will be shortly changing a little bit and be part of the WorkSafe Tasmania website in the months to come, but essentially the same program will be on offer. So jump on board. You will also notice on the tables we have some more recent relevant information that WorkSafe Tasmania has put together for the sector. So you'll be able to see where the various aspects of the transport sector are being affected and how, the injuries, the people, the action areas, the causes of injuries, and there's also a booklet to go with that. So by all means, feel free to take those with you today to share with others back in the workplace. And I think we're just about, it is 10:28, so I'm conscious that our live stream viewers will soon be coming on board, or will be on board already. So we will start to introduce the session. We've got a fairly full program today, and I'm well aware of how time slips, and before we know it, we're running over, which we hope not to do today. So welcome everybody to the 21st Better Work Tasmania networking session for the transport sector. As indicated, I've had a lot of assistance from the Tasmanian Transport Association and some key members to help with putting today's session together, and in particular also the Safety Institute of Australia also partners with Better Work Tasmania in order to provide these sessions, and I thank them too for their continued support. And so I'd like to welcome John DeBruyn, Chairman of the Tasmanian Transport Association, to give us an overview of work health and safety in the Tasmanian transport sector. John will cover supply chain, change of responsibility resources and current TTA projects. Thank you, John.
So good morning. Thank you, Pam, for that introduction. I'm pleased to provide the introduction to this important industry safety and networking forum, and we thank Pam and the team at Better Work Tasmania for the opportunity to explore the safety issues and initiatives on the agenda today. To start, I'll provide a little bit of background to the TTA and the work that we're doing to support our members and the safety and productivity of our industry. TTA is a members-based industry association established in 1960. Our membership includes rail, shipping, warehousing and road transport. And within road transport membership spans from general freight, containerised freight, dangerous goods, refrigerated, food freight, forestry, civil construction, oversize, overmass, and membership also includes businesses that provide mechanical, auditing and training services to our industry. So we welcome membership from businesses of all sizes across the industry. Our key role is to support our members to provide an efficient, effective, safe and sustainable transport operations to and from and within Tasmania. We do this by influencing both the regulation of transport and the provision of transport infrastructures through projects that respond to the needs of our industry and our workforce. We represent the Tasmanian industry on a number of state and national forums, including the NHVR Industry Reference Forum, the Australian Trucking Association National Council and the Tasmanian Road Safety Advisory Council. And we appreciate our platinum partners, which are National Transport Insurance and the TW Super Fund. And without them, we wouldn't be able to do what we do for our industry. So transport and logistics is a very important industry for Tasmania. The Tasmanian industry accounts for around 1,356 businesses. Half of them are in road freight transport. 12,800 people directly employed by the industry by transport and logistics, and 6.1% of gross state product is represented by our industry, and more than 11,000 heavy vehicles are registered in Tasmania. Basically, transport and logistics are very critical to the Tasmanian economy, enabling Tasmanian businesses, farmers, manufacturers and customers to access local and global markets. Our industry is a key enabler of economic activity, and we like to say transport drives the Tasmanian economy. TTA activities focus on what we need for our industry to be safe and productive. For a safe and productive Tasmanian transport industry, we believe we need the right workforce, we need the right vehicles and equipment, we need the right infrastructure and we need the right regulation. TTA has projects and advocacy work relating to each one of these aspects of the industry. All of these are relevant to the safety of people in transport and logistics and to the others, including road users as well. Our workforce, the transport industry is facing a skill shortage in key occupation including drivers, trainers, forklift operators and transport supervisors. The issue is local, national, but also global. The freight task is increasing and the age of our driver workforce is also increasing, ageing at 2.2 times faster than the average across industries. This is a problem for now, but even more so when you consider that the freight time, the task is set to double between 2010 and 2030. It's a huge issue for our industry. The projected growth in freight is above that of both population and economic growth. 47% of our workforce is aged 45 plus, 23.6% aged 55 years plus. Our industry overall is 80% male, and nationally 96% of our truck drivers are male. We need to do more to attract people to the transport and logistics industry, And once we have them, we need to be able to develop them and keep them in the industry. The TTA is working to develop a new workforce plan to provide a blueprint for how we can do this. We'll be hosting a site at AgFest this year to promote the professionalism of our industry and a wide range of careers that are available in our industry. And if you want to be involved in that or interested in that, Michelle is be more than happy to talk to you about that. The other one is vehicle and equipment. In May last year, the Transport Minister agreed to the drafting of a new Australian driving laws for autonomous vehicles to allow an automated driving system to drive more automated vehicles in place of humans. The purpose-built law is planned for 2020, but as a community we have some way to go before we can accept autonomous vehicles sharing our road. And as an operator of trucks myself, I've got some huge reservations, but this is potentially the future. Other advances in truck technology are already making differences though. These include a whole range of safety improvements such as emergency braking, crash avoidance, braking systems, rollover protection systems, airbags, load restraint systems, all sorts of telematics in heavy vehicles now, and they are expanding also into regulatory applications such as granting network access, recording hours of work and rest through an electronic diary, and recording onboard vehicle mass as well. The transport sector already uses telematics heavily now to support safety, information about the driver activity, including speeding, harsh braking, idle times, and engine performance, and it's a great tool. Between 1971 and 2007, the trucking industry productivity increased sixfold due to the uptake of high productivity vehicles like B-doubles. Australian trucking operators are global leaders and have pioneered the modern, safe and more productive vehicle designs. Road trains, not in Tasmania obviously, but highly productive vehicle combinations and deliver improved safety and productivity for our supply chains. And Ausroad's research report found that high productivity vehicles were safer, used less fuel and offered significant economic benefit to a range of industries. TTA continues to work with industry and with the Department of State Growth Access team to explore options for improved access of high productivity vehicles in Tasmania. The next one, infrastructure. Debruyne to Hobart Freight Corridor is the core of Tasmania's land freight network, connecting all major population and industry and export centres. The corridor supports the movement of high volumes of freight and forms a part of nearly every major supply chain in the state. The Tasmanian Government has recognised the significance of this freight corridor in the Tasmanian Freight Strategy and has a number of projects underway to support the infrastructure that is needed for the future. Suitable and safe areas where our drivers can pull over and check their loads and take rest breaks is a very important consideration when looking at transport infrastructure. There are national guidelines about rest areas for heavy vehicles, and Tasmania currently does not meet these guidelines. The TTA, with the support of the Tasmanian Government, is working with industry to develop a heavy vehicle driver rest area strategy. As part of this, we are auditing the key freight routes and identifying where expanded and new facilities are needed. Again, if you're interested in that and you want to know more about that, feel free to talk to Michelle or myself. Heavy vehicle national laws have changed in October 2018. This brought the law into line with work health and safety laws. In in that all parties have a duty to identify and control risks. The other key change was to strengthen the chain of responsibility provisions under the law. Chain of responsibility recognises that all parties in the transport chain, not just the driver and the operator, can have control or influence over the safety of the transport activity. Parties in the chain are named up in the law and are listed on the screen. One person might have multiple roles under the chain of responsibility. There's lots of resources to assist you if you need to know more. There are tools available to help transport operators and others in the chain to meet their obligations. These include the Transport Industry Master Code, a registered industry code of practice under the heavy vehicle national law, and it sets out our industry risks and possible controls for the COR parties. Industry accreditation programs such as WorkSafe, which is about to release a reviewed standards to become an enabler of the Master Code as well. This will support WorkSafe accredited businesses to demonstrate that they can meet COR systems and have COR systems in place. Safety management system tools are available from the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator, free on the NHVR website. The Tasmanian Transport Association can support all parties in the supply chain to understand their COR responsibilities. We're working now with 3 Tasmanian operators to map out their supply chain and identify the COR parties and associated risks and controls. Please get in touch again with us if you want some help or you've got challenges in this area. Regulation. Transport and logistics is heavily regulated. The national regulator, the NHVR, operates in all states except Western Australia and Northern Territory and regulates heavy vehicle national law. In 2018, NHVR took up the compliance and enforcement functions in Tasmania, previously conducted by the Department of State Growth, the Transport Inspectors. Principal Safety and Compliance Officers with the NHVR, Michael Leonard, is here today. If you have any questions about the work of NHVR, I'm sure he'd be happy to talk to you as well. Last year, the Transport Minister agreed to bring forward the review of the heavy vehicle national law and regulations. This will be a full review, not just fixing up some sections. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to build a law that supports our industry. The TTA will consult with industry as the review progresses so that we can represent your views. There's a website set up for all information about the review and the address is on the screen. TTA will keep members informed as we engage with this really important process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So our next speaker is Dr. Luke Mirowski, Senior Research Fellow from the University of Tasmania, and his presentation is titled Tools to Improve Transport Safety and Productivity Through Fatigue Management, Results and Lessons from Recent Work with Australian Forestry Companies. Thank you, Luke.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Luke Mirowski. I work for the University of Tasmania, and I also work as a private industry consultant on logistics, safety and productivity. Pamela, thanks for inviting me out here this morning, and John, thanks for the presentation. I think you really captured the essence of safety and the importance of relating it back to productivity, and that's what I'm going to be talking about this morning, safety and productivity, but in the context of fatigue management. So I'm going to be talking a lot about work that I've done on mainland Australia with the forest industry, but I think the lessons learned and the principles that I'm going to share with you are applicable to a lot of industries. And so although it's a deep dive into forestry, I think you'll see the common COR entities along the chain. I think you'll see the common sorts of problems that exist up in the warehouses or the forests, in the unloading and the loading and the unloading down at the ports, and all of the pressures in between and how they play out with fatigue. I'm going to be presenting tools to help with fatigue management, and when I look at compliance, I look at that as a really great tool set that a business and a supply chain can adopt to get improvement around fatigue management. Of course, there are other sorts of tools, and as of October 2018, risk-based approaches are now encouraged to manage fatigue. When I first started looking at fatigue management, I was doing that with WorkSafe Tasmania, and they kindly sponsored a research project at the university. And 6 years ago, we built a system that we are giving away at no charge to industry that digitises paper diaries, and it also tracks and traces vehicles and operators, and it also gives you fatigue risk curves. We were doing this 6 years ago, well before the discussion around electronic work diaries is really congealed into what we now have and what the industry can use. So I like to think we were ahead of the curve a little bit, but I guess the challenges around getting those tools accepted from a governance standpoint was where the delays were. But fortunately, there are a whole range of digital tools now that you can leverage. And I'm going to be presenting those a little bit later in my presentation as a tool set that you can easily grab and put into the supply chain. When I first started working in fatigue, I got a phone call from some landowners in South Australia 6 years ago, and they asked me to come over and make a presentation to the forest industry that was situated around Mount Gambier. Mount Gambier is the hub of Australian forestry in what's called the Green Triangle. And I gave this presentation to about 600 people in a place called the Barn. The Barn was packed out on the day, and they'd all come to hear my presentation and the presentation of 3 or 4 other speakers. And I felt at the end of giving that presentation that what I was talking about was something foreign to the people in the room. When I talked about fatigue, everyone agreed and said that that was an important issue, and that fatigue was a factor in a lot of workplace accidents and vehicle runoffs. After I left Mount Gambier on that day, I never got a phone call. I thought a lot of people would want to phone me up and ask me to come across and do some work for them, but nobody phoned me up. And I thought, that's fine. And I went on and I did a lot of other work around Australia on fatigue management. It was about a year ago when I got another phone call from Mount Gambier, and this time they said, we need your services because there's been a vehicle runoff. And in 2016, November, 3 a.m. on a Saturday morning, 4 men crashed their sedan into a blue gum just outside of Penola and killed themselves. And they were on the way to a block to go and cut trees. And that was the catalyst for that entire industry starting to have a better look at fatigue and fatigue management, and not just from a trucking perspective, because from a trucking perspective, they do it reasonably well. If they're driving forestry trucks, most of them are over 4.5 tonne, and most of them are going outside of a 100-kilometre radius, which requires them to be under chain of responsibility and NHVR compliance. So I went back over there, and I've since been working with a lot of the industry players in the Green Triangle looking at this issue of fatigue. And when I first talked about it in Mount Gambier 6 years ago, people knew what it was, but they didn't want to accept it and recognise it. How we changed the culture over there is by really just stating the obvious. It's a lack of sleep, okay? And we started to have a look at these businesses and say, why aren't people in the GT getting proper sleep? They can be in compliance with NHVR and COR, but they're still coming to work with a lack of sleep. And so we did a lot of work around basic education and telling people that fatigue, which is a very academic term, is really something that everyone's accustomed to in this industry. It's a lack of sleep. It's the feeling that you get up here in your head or in your body after you've worked for 14 hours in a harvesting machine. Okay? It's how you feel at the end of a shift after you've been in a machine that's vibrating, where the diesel fumes are so strong that you feel dizzy and sick. Okay? It's the environmental stresses of being out in the forest around Mount Gambier in the heat and the noise of forestry. Okay? And it's the work schedules and the payment systems that keep you up on the block or in the truck or down at the port because you have a mortgage to pay. And it wasn't until we started to change the terminology and put it into plain English that people started to pay attention and start to say, well, you know, in our business we do have a fatigue problem. Okay? We're not giving our people enough time to sleep. And they're coming to work fatigued because of all of these very simple factors. All of these factors are controllable, and the tools that I'm going to talk about are really good at controlling them. It's really about culture, and it's about how the businesses in the supply chain want to adopt and respond to those pressures. So the definitions of fatigue are quite simple, but why do we still have a fatigue problem? From what I've learnt working with the Australian forest industry, culture plays a large part, okay? And the focus on trucking also has an impact on not drawing attention to other elements of the chain where there are fatigue issues. And I'll talk very briefly in a moment about some examples of where the focus of fatigue management tends to ignore the fatigue risks and hazards up in the forest and also down at the port. And forestry workers and others in the supply chains that everyone in this room is accustomed to can cause fatigue on drivers, but those drivers can also cause fatigue on the workers that aren't in the trucks. And that's one of the core experiences that I'll relate to today. So to get people listening, I always talk about productivity and safety. And I think John did a really good presentation to articulate that fine balance. You know, the truck in the depot is safe, but it's not very productive. So we have to find the balance between those two factors, and it's not an easy one. It's not an easy one, but we know from academic research that if you manage fatigue, you'll actually be more productive. And I've got some great examples coming up where businesses who have managed fatigue have actually made a lot of money. What I'm seeing when I work with supply chains and companies on the mainland is that there is a trend to preference operators and companies that are managing fatigue, because businesses are starting to realise that fatigue makes you less productive. It also makes you less safe. But if you ask someone for money to pay for a fatigue system, usually they'll say they have no money. But if you say that managing fatigue will also bring you productivity gains, then they're willing to pay for it. So this is the context in which I talk about fatigue and fatigue safety. And I always approach it from a supply chain perspective. So whether it's the forestry supply chain or the seafood supply chain or the beef supply chain, or you're a 3PL and you're doing a line haul for Woolies or Coles, you're all in a supply chain and you're all having an impact on fatigue. And that's what chain of responsibility legislation is about. But over the years, a lot of companies have said, we don't realise we're in the chain. Okay? NHVR's got a great tool for auditing, and I've used that with many companies. It allows you to work with supply chain entities and work through a series of checklists to identify roles and responsibilities and also deficiencies. And that's a tool that every company here, I think, should look up. It's called the NHVR COR auditing tool, I believe. But it's great because if you're in a supply chain, you can work out quite rapidly what sort of impacts you're having on your trucks. But for me, it's more than just the trucks, it's everyone in the supply chain. So that's the kind of agenda that I want to set for my presentation, and there's not a lot of time, so I'll probably skip through a few slides, but if you certainly want a copy of my slides, by all means contact me. The first set of tools that I like to think are available for fatigue management are compliance and auditing based, and these are often looked at as imposts on the supply chain and tools that tend to bring productivity down. My experience has been that businesses that adopt tools that are compliance-based actually create a great landscape in which you can introduce more risk-based tools to get better safety and productivity uplift, provided everyone in the chain recognises the benefits. The first set of tools that you might be familiar with are COR-based that come from NHVR, and we've probably all seen the rules around work and rest. I've worked with a lot of trucking companies on mainland Australia, and what I've seen is that when businesses adopt this set of rules, they're actually quite productive and they're also managing fatigue really well. Last year I finished a consultancy with a very big haulage company that hauled wood chip from Portland in Victoria, from Myman in South Australia through to Portland. And they had adopted COR advanced fatigue management. And we strapped wristbands on the drivers. We did pre and post interviews with them. We gave them food diaries. We gave them an app to use to record different risks in their daily operations, and we found after 1 month that there wasn't a fatigue issue. And they had really good sleep. They worked for 10 hours solid in the truck, and they followed all of the rules, and when they came in the next day, they were at a 0 fatigue score on a 20-point scale. In other businesses that have adopted these rules, where they're followed and there is a good evidence base to validate that they've been following those rules, we see the same sort of thing. And we've seen this in lots and lots of haulage companies all over Australia. Where we've seen pressures have been around the paper-based diaries still. So the original WorkSafe program that I was involved in 6 years ago was looking at digitising these paper diaries. And when we put our fatigue app out there, and we got truck drivers using it, we actually found that they were better at reporting their work hours. They liked reporting them because it got them off the hook if there was a problem at the loading or in the unloading sites, and it gave the driver an evidence base to prove that they were in compliance, and that was quite revolutionary 6 years ago. So they loved it, and they also loved it because it was really easy to use. You didn't need to write or read very well, and we know actually in the trucking industry, one of the major problems is literacy and numeracy. So what we had come up with 6 years ago really improved this, and it's great to see NHVR has finally gotten around to electronic work diary approval. But we were doing that 6 years ago. Where we also have seen a set of problems still occurring has been around general duty, and it's great that a whole of system approach is now being advocated to general duty that really encourages alignment with OH&S principles right across the chain as of October 2018. But what we were seeing prior to that was a lot of haulage companies in chains not really wanting to acknowledge the risks that they were creating both in the trucking operations and also back up in the forests and down at the ports. So we tended to see truck drivers doing the right thing with their paper diaries, but not enough acknowledgement around what was happening up in the forest on the trucks, so keeping the trucks waiting, for example. But equally, where the trucks were coming late and keeping the forestry workers on the block for longer than they should be. So hopefully that's going to improve now that it's become a primary duty. And I think that creates a context to start to look into those interrelationships further along the chain. So the attention isn't just on the truck drivers, but it's also on how the truck drivers have impacts on people and also the people on the trucks. What happened in South Australia when those 4 men killed themselves driving into a blue gum was that the regulators at the national and state levels got together and said we need to actually look at fatigue, not just around the trucks, but also further along the chain. And in the past year and a half in South Australia, there's been a lot of attention applied to fatigue management right across forestry supply chains. And businesses in South Australia are now having to introduce fatigue management systems beyond the trucks, back up in the forest and down at the ports. And another tool set to bring your attention to is the tools that come from Safe Work Australia. So yes, we have NHVR and COR compliance and rules, but if you're in an organisation that not only does trucking but also does warehousing or scheduling, or you're a consignee or a consignor and you want to actually start to leverage the power of fatigue compliance tools, have a look at the Safe Work guidelines, because they've actually been around for quite some time and they're about encouraging a general approach to fatigue management across entire businesses. Businesses in South Australia have started to adopt these systems, and I've been working with those businesses a lot on that. The challenge we've seen is that the literature is great, but if you're a business, you kind of look at the documents from Safe Work Australia and you say, how does it apply to me? So we've been using a set of technologies, and one of those is fatigue risk management systems, to try and translate all of that best practice into the business. But it's worth having a look at the Safe Work set of tools. There's another great body of tools out there, and they actually come from Safe Work Victoria, and they were developed for the forest industry, but they're actually really good for a lot of other businesses in supply chains that want to manage fatigue. So you might be managing a warehouse. Have a look at the Safe Work Victoria literature on fatigue management. It talks a lot about forestry, but the principles are fantastic for warehousing, because it talks about the identification of fatigue at the start of a shift and during a shift. It talks about fitness for work, and it relates that back to due diligence, which is at the heart of all safety systems. And in my read of a lot of fatigue management literature over the years, in terms of businesses in Australia, I think this Victorian work is a great body to have a look at and then potentially apply into your businesses. And there's a lot of free stuff in that Safe Work Victoria set of guidelines that you can just grab. So they've got checklists and they've got fitness for work tools that you could start applying today, okay, and it's free. The other big set of tools that's recently been generated out of South Australia around fatigue that has really nothing to do just with trucks comes from LETA, so the Log Training Association. And their role had historically been focused on log truck drivers, but because of the vehicle runoff, they've developed a work health and safety auditing standard that looks into fatigue, and that's a free set of tools that are available, a free set of checklists that you can take and apply to businesses to look at fatigue and what your business is doing to resolve fatigue-based issues. Some work that I've been involved in over the last 12 months with Professor Drew Dawson, who's Australia's leading fatigue expert, has been to develop up a free set of guidelines for the forest industry. But those guidelines, although again written for forestry, are great for any supply chain. So they're available at the LETA website and you can have a look at that. Now, they're tools that are risk-based, compliance-based, and they tend to formulate a set of rules for businesses to then adopt. And what I've seen is that businesses that adopt those rules and get the buy-in from a cultural standpoint across the chain do quite well. Work that I've been doing in South Australia has taken me down a fatigue risk management systems approach. And although you have a lot of these guidelines that are out there, the question becomes for businesses, and especially small businesses, how do I integrate those into my operation? How do I get my supply chain partners to actually buy into a fatigue management approach? And that leads us to technology. Technology is great, but it's only part of the solution. iCams and Fitbits and apps are useful, but they need to be embedded both within a culture in the organisation and also within a risk management framework. And so I'm going to point out just a couple of tools that are freely available that we've used previously. The first set is called the Logistics Fatigue Manager. It came out of the WorkSafe Tasmania project. And there's a free app that drivers can use, but also people further along the chain. And it allows you to put in how much sleep you've had, and it gives you a risk score on a 20-point scale as to how fatigued you are. If you're the type of person that gets 8 to 9 hours of sleep every day consistently, you'll be starting your shift at 0 out of 20. If you get 3 or 4 hours of sleep, which is quite common actually in the forest industry, you'll be starting at around 10 or 12 points. So we've worked a lot with operators up in the forests and also truck drivers and people at the ports to use this tool and fine-tune it, and we know that it works. It leverages sleep science, but the interface is really simple. It has 3 buttons, play, pause or stop, and if you can use your TV remote control, you can use this software. It's great because it creates a data set for the driver, it creates a data set for the user, and it also creates a data set for the business. So that's one set of tools. The last thing that I'll leave you with, because Pam's tapping on her glass, and does that mean I've exceeded the time or have I got a minute? Just, okay. So the last thing I'll leave you with is some work that we've done with Fitbits. Okay, now this is a technology that actually the new risk-based approach that came out in October 2018 actually supports under the Logistics Association's guidelines. You can start to leverage these sorts of actigraphy devices. And if you put these on your operators or your truck drivers, there's a lot of insight that you can generate and you can bring that back into your business. And we did this with harvesters in South Australia, and we showed them that if you get a good night's sleep, you'll actually cut more trees the next day. Okay? It's pretty simple, isn't it? But we worked with these operators, and when they weren't in a fatigue management system, they were cutting 1 stem every 1 minute at the start of the day, and by the end of the day, they were cutting 1 stem every 5 minutes. When we put them into the fatigue management system, they were safer, they were getting less LTIs, but they were cutting more trees, and that paid for the system that we set up for them. Okay? So that's what we call a fatigue management system, and that's really where businesses need to get to. Okay? And I think it has to be across the supply chain, not just the trucks, because we're all in a chain of responsibility. Thanks for listening. Are we taking questions? Or?
Yeah, any questions?
Yes.
The effect of ageing on fatigue. We read a lot about that as you get older you don't need as much sleep. What would you like to comment on that?
Well, we've worked with lots of different age groups, and I can tell you actually that the old adage around old pilots and bold pilots holds true, and the fatigue risks that get put into the supply chain from what we've seen come from the young workers, the workers that like to go out and have a few beers every night or go down to the pub in Mount Gambier and, you know, party until 2 a.m. and then they start at 6. The older operators that we've worked with have a lot of experience, and they set the cultural tone for the business. And I worked with one driver that did a line haul in the forest industry. He used to drive from Mount Gambier down to Portland, and he used to do that a couple of times a day. It's a long stretch. used to go to bed at 8 p.m. every night, and he would get up at exactly the same time the next morning, and he did that day in, day out. He had the best fatigue scores we'd ever seen, and he was a gentleman in his early 60s. So this idea that we need technology to do a good job, I don't fully buy into, even though my background is originally technology. I think culture, I think learning from your peers plays a lot of influence around how we manage safety. Yes?
As you mentioned earlier about electronic work diaries, are they currently in the process with the NHBR? Because my understanding was that there's none authorised yet.
There's a lot of discussion, and there has been for over 5 years, and a lot of delay. I'm not fully up to speed with where they're at in terms of acceptance, but what I've seen is that there's now a framework for IT companies to start to develop up systems and put them out there. And I believe MT Data, I think, have a module that's available or ready to go, but I don't know whether that can take data and submit it to the NHBR yet.
Yes, I can answer that, having asked this question of the NHBR a week ago. Luke's right, that took a long time to actually, there was always provision for electronic work diaries under the law, but they needed to write the standards for them. And the standards are quite complex, and they then need to assess any applications that come forward. I believe they have one application which they are hoping to start assessing. So I think we're probably still a way off that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Luke. So our next speaker is Dr. Daniel Bongers, and he is the creator of the Smart Cap fatigue monitoring product and co-founder of the current CTO of Smart Cap Technologies. And Daniel will talk to us about the use of wearables and fatigue safety. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. Don't clap yet, you haven't heard me talk. I thought that last presentation really, it summed up the fatigue space really well. And I loved how it finished by saying fatigue technology is one part of a holistic system. And so maybe one thought that's good to keep in mind as I go through the stuff I'm going to talk about is just keep the word gaps in mind. Compliance systems and regulations have gaps. Technology has gaps, and what I'm talking about in the technology space is really to fill in one of those gaps, and that's it. But the reason I'm here today, the reason our company exists is every day, every single day, on average 14 people die falling asleep at the wheel, and the most at risk are professional drivers. And technology exists to fill that gap, to make that stat disappear. And so I'm not here to impress you with the technology, the particular technology that I represent. I'm here to talk about all technologies. More importantly, I'm here to impress upon you the opportunity that does exist by using technology in this space. How do I use this? There we go. I'll first run through what's out there. So the fatigue technology space, these go back probably around 25, 30 years now. And in 2003, there were 81 fatigue technologies on the market. Today, there are 36 fatigue technologies on the market. Almost all of them are toys. And what's really interesting is the ones that aren't toys are the ones that were at the top of the list of the 81 and still remain at the top of the list today. The first flavour of technology, which was touched on in the earlier presentation, is things to do with how we decide when people work. So we've got regulations around how much we can work, for shift work operations, or even when we're talking about scheduling loads. There exist a bunch of tools, sometimes spreadsheet tools, sometimes a bit more sophisticated, that really talk about what someone's risk is going to be at a particular point in time, and depending on the technology, they'll flag red or beep at you and tell you that's no good, you shouldn't schedule someone in there, or that's going to be a really risky shift, or something along those lines. And those technologies have matured a little bit to the point now where actigraphs or activity monitors like a Fitbit or something similar feed into that model. And so rather than it being one size fits all, now these tools really are forward-looking about the risk profile for that particular person based on their recent sleep history or activity history. The second flavour of technology that's out there is what we broadly call screening technologies, sometimes referred to as fitness for work technologies. And these have gone through a bunch of different generations over the years, but essentially they're a test of a person now to see if a person is fit to continue work from this point now. And so technically you would call, say, drug and alcohol testing to fall into this category, but in the fatigue space, these screening technologies go all the way from follow the bouncing ball across the screen and check how you're performing, to these space-aged things that you put over your face and they do a laser response test or ocular response test. All of these tools, these screening tools, like I said, are testing a person now. And so the great thing about that is they're able to identify impairment of an individual that might be related to fatigue, but it could be related to drugs, alcohol, severe depression, or a bunch of other stuff. But again, the gap with these technologies is that they only tell you about the person now and they don't tell you anything about the person an hour from now. And so if you were to take the same two people, twins, with the same sleep history and the same eating history, and put each of them in a truck doing a similar journey, one of them for that journey stretches their legs, takes semi-regular breaks, eats green apples and broccoli, and the other person has a packet of cigarettes between cans of Red Bull, it's fairly fair to say that 8 hours from now, despite having the exact same score on the screening test, they're going to be at a slightly different fatigue risk state. The third flavour of technologies is the place I most commonly sit, and that's the real-time driver or real-time equipment operator technologies. And within this flavour of technology, there's two kinds. There's the wearable technologies, which is close to my heart, and the much more well-known driver-facing camera. I think it's the next slide is going to highlight that, and my position, despite representing a particular brand, is that one technology isn't necessarily better than another, and I hope what the following slide shows is that they're different to each other and they do very, very different things. And so what that more means is they can complement each other if need be. So, like I said, there are 4 or 5 serious real-time monitoring technologies on the market today that were on the market 10 years ago. And despite, in the 10 years since, about 75 products coming and going, the top 4 or 5 have stayed the top 4 or 5. And of that top 4 or 5, only 3 have, I guess, significant market penetration around the world. So, just to give a perspective of where they all sort of fit together, if you imagine this rectangle being a fatigue spectrum where on your left is bouncing off the walls hyperalert, and on the very far right is clinically asleep, where there's some spectrum in between where you'd call this awake, and somewhere toward the right of it you'd say that's when you're starting to get fatigued. The thing that we're told to fear, and the thing that we're most familiar with, is referred to as an eyes closed microsleep, or for the scientists, a behavioral microsleep. This is characterized by the eyes like involuntarily closing. If it lasts long enough, our head might fall forward and snap back. It's a microsleep. What's poorly known worldwide is that 100% of the time, for every mammal, humans included, is that before every behavioral microsleep is an eyes open microsleep. This is where, on the outside, there's zero change in external symptoms, no change in eye behavior, no change in posture, no change in fidgeting, but nobody's at home. So we're clinically asleep, and even the person sitting beside us can't tell. And where the fatigue technologies sit is attempting to detect when a particular individual fits somewhere on this spectrum. The different technologies look at different bits of the spectrum. As you move across, the earlier you intervene toward this spectrum, toward an unintended sleep, the less severe the further to the left, the less severe the need for intervention or the nature of the intervention itself. So if a technology or something magical is able to tell someone, you're heading in the wrong direction, it's time to give you a bit of an early warning. At that point, a professional driver can do something simple. They can sit up straight, bite the wedge of an apple, wind down the window. They could do the 4 or 5 things that they really do that don't work whatsoever, like have a Red Bull, light a cigarette. Those have a very, very short-term gain for a medium and long-term pain. But worldwide, the best we've found is eating the wedge of a green apple for a bunch of reasons that I can talk about if you're interested. If we move further to the right, where a person is, at this point now, genuinely at risk. They're not asleep, but this person is, say, 10 minutes away if the stars align, and to them, the next 10 minutes is low stimulus, it's boring. That person is likely to have an unintended sleep. Risk now exists because that person and no technology knows the future. So the actions they would take are a bit more severe. They might really now need to pull over, stretch their legs. They might, depending on the industry they're in, update their take file or their job risk assessment. How am I going to get through the rest of the day safely? They might have a conversation with another human, get on the radio, get on the phone, which is always a positive thing. And if we use technology at the very far end of the spectrum, now the actions we take could be potentially much more severe. If a person's progressed all the way through this point of risk, they've been asleep at the wheel with no external symptoms, and now their eyes have closed, the muscles have relaxed, and the head's fallen forward, and the truck's off the road. Now the actions are to call the police, call the insurer. And so the 4 top technologies and where they fit on this spectrum. No names. One technology really focuses on the early warning spectrum prior to the unintended sleep. Another technology does the same, but has a bit broader of a spread. There are 2 well-established technologies, which are the driver-facing cameras, and they operate more at the further end of the spectrum once those physical symptoms start to appear. Now, the philosophy of technology 1 and 2 is, put it on a marketing brochure if you please, but prevention is better than detection. But in reality, what they're saying is, if you detect the progression towards risk, you can take certain actions as a business or as a driver. The philosophy of technology 3 and 4 is equally valid, it's just different, and it's saying technology 1 and 2 are asking you to intervene and do something when nothing's happened yet. What they're doing is they're detecting when something's happened and empowering the driver and empowering the business to prevent tragedy by, for example, waking up the driver. So I was asked as part of this presentation to do a product demonstration, and I'd rather not, because I don't really want to make this about the one I do. So not saying which one mine is, but mine's a wearable technology, and I'm happy to sort of play around with it later. But to give you a gist of what the technology we're talking about, the one I work with, the one I invented in 2004, is the latest generation. It's something you wear on your head. It measures brain activity, and it determines a person's alertness and fatigue score in real time, gives it to them on a screen, and if they get to a point of risk, it alerts not only them, but it can alert their boss. And so what the product is itself is a band. And if you put a strap on the back, you can look like Karate Kid and wear it as a headband, or you can just clip it into a cap and wear it. There'll be a screen in the cab, or use your smartphone, and it'll just tell you where you're at. That's one of the technologies that exists. And I'd be more than happy to talk anyone through each of the technologies, the pros and cons of each, and to introduce anyone that you need to the other vendors if need be. Okie dokie, moving on. One of the things we've learnt over the past 10 years, and now having started this as a little business in Brisbane, Queensland, more than 10 years ago, and now expanding to customers in 31 countries, we've learnt some lessons along the way, holding hands with our customers. And so what I wanted to talk about was the challenges the businesses have faced that have implemented technology, not just ours, any technology. The first one is to assess them. And so you should never believe people like me. I sell this stuff for a living. So never swallow the pitch. So the difficult thing is no one's ever going to say, well, that sounded really cool, I'll buy 100 of those. So what they do is they test it. They want to buy 1, buy 5, and test it out. And that's not as easy as you might think. And so what we've learned is the word is irrelevant. Call it an apple and a banana, but we use the word trial versus pilot. We consider a trial of a technology, testing if it does what it says it does. Does that thing measure alertness? Does that thing tell me when I've fallen asleep, and so on? And I would say there's probably very few people, if any, in the room who would have the scientific background to appropriately test if the technology accurately does what it says it does, which is why the technologies owe it to all of you to have these things independently validated by all the eggheads in the world, so that you can read everything that's out there from other people to say, okay, it does what it does. Where I think a business is like from the people in this room is from what we call a pilot, which is not testing if this thing measures alertness or if this thing measures sleep. It's more, does this fit with our business? Does our workforce accept this? Can we make it all fit and get some gains from it? And so I think if people start looking on the left-hand side at the trial stage, I think that they're probably too skeptical that no matter how they go through the process, the skepticism will still be there at the end of whatever 2-month or 3-month little test that they do. So there are ways to do it, and the best way to do it is talk to the thousands of businesses around the world who've done it before you, because they can tell you all the stories of what you're going to find out. The challenge with this process is there's seemingly no hard acceptance criteria. And so you could say, well, I just want to see if my drivers will wear it. Unfortunately, people say, I just want to see if my guys will wear it, because like we heard, 96% of drivers in Australia tragically are male. But I just want to see if my drivers will use it, will wear it, will whatever. And that's really hard to gauge, because even in a 2-month, 3-month pilot, mandatory, voluntary, however you play it, if people really did use it in this 2 months or 3 months, that's because it was only 2 months or 3 months. That's telling you nothing about 6 months down the track where this is a hard rule and mandatory, and if you want to work here, you have to use it. That's not what you're assessing. You're assessing this on a small scale test. So that's one example of where what you really want to know, it's actually fairly hard to assess. And so we spend a lot of our time working through the process. The technology is the technology. We put almost all of our effort now into the deployment and engagement component of doing what we do. The other bit of pushback you'll often find is that we're the guinea pigs. We're always the guinea pigs. Our company, our work group, our terminal, our depot, we're the guinea pigs. And so it's really, really important that if that's the sense that you move towards, this is a pilot, we're not testing the technology on you. You're our valued employees, and we want your feedback about the best way to use this in our business. It's a totally different sentiment. So like I said, it's really important to do your homework. There's thousands of companies around the world who use all of these things, and they've got heaps of experience, and they will give you the unfiltered warts and all version of it. The other thing that's super mega important is that introducing technology doesn't completely overhaul procedures and policies. It's just something else. And so if right now, if your business has a procedure or policy, written down or not, of if someone puts a hand up and says, I'm too tired to keep driving, whatever they do then, do that when the technology says they're probably too tired to keep driving. Don't go and have a whole new set of policies or relax your definition of what an incident is just because you've now got a technology. Okay, challenge number 2, driver acceptance. It's a big one. Operator acceptance or driver acceptance, depending what industry you're in. It's important to understand the very, very unique concerns if part of your workforce aren't direct employees, they're contractors or owner-operators. And their fear is if this technology shows them to be fatigued, that's it, they're out. They've got no chance of full-time employment, no chance of contract renewal. They have unique concerns that are well beyond the already existing concerns of permanent employees. Well, our experience has been, and to take something like this hat as an example, some of the concerns you hear are just like fantasy land made up. And you really have to scratch under the surface to find out what's really going on here. And so, what are you telling me? This thing's got a battery in it? Doesn't that give you cancer? They said asbestos was safe. And then you start hearing all of these things about, I want you to show me the documents that prove this, whatever thing is safe. But when you ask more and more and more, if this works, that's the real concern. The real concern is they don't think that this like off-the-shelf commercial product used all over the world is really a cancer machine. The real fear is, I'm trying to find something I'm allowed to push back on. I'm allowed to push back on safety. Because my real fear is, you're bringing this in, and if I get a whole bunch of fatigue alarms, I'm out of a job, and I've got bills to pay. And then what you'll also find is that you're bringing in a technology which unfortunately is often introduced as a silver bullet. Bringing this in, you'll hear if they really cared about fatigue, they would fix the headlights, they would fix the cracked windshields, they would not push us so hard, they would stick to the rules, they would whatever. And so it's really, really important that everybody involved in this is engaged from the beginning through to the end. This is something we've always heard, it's always true, and businesses even today still get it wrong. And it's really important, now that we're with technology measuring the person, the human, it's really, really important as the laws start evolving that we make sure we've got proper controls in place for privacy. I'm conscious of time, and so I've got a couple of other of these, and I'm sure the slides will be available through the internet or something. But anyways, so the point was already made. These technologies, the fact is they don't cost money. They make you money. It's been proven over and over again. One of our customers, a large US customer with a fleet of 28,000 trucks, because they're so big, they brought in a team of business intelligence people to run the hard numbers on what they've seen with the technology before and after. Broken tail lights through to rollovers and everything in between. And what they found on a month-by-month basis. So forget the tremendous moral and financial benefits of hurting, injuring, or killing less people. If you just start talking about the short-term out-of-pocket expenses associated with more fatigued driving, they were able to prove greater than a 400% return on investment on a month-by-month basis. These technologies don't cost a lot. Read all the brochures, cost of a cup of coffee a day or whatever they say, but the reality is they don't really cost money, they make money, and I think that point's been well made. So I'll skip through that. The last one, we've kind of already touched on, the policies and procedures. You've really got to get this right. And often, I think the biggest mistake that we've seen is we want to try this new shiny thing, we put it in, we get a feel for it, and then and only then, if we like it, if it sort of seems to make a bit of sense to us, then we'll go and get some policies sort of drafted up and have a talk about them. But like I said, the fear from the potential users, the drivers and equipment operators, the fear comes on day one, and so do the questions. And the questions are, what happens if this happens? What happens if that? And if your answer is, oh, we'll get to that, we'll get to the policies, we'll get there, it just fuels those fears. And so thinking through the policy stuff up front is a pretty good thing to do. What I want to move on to is some results. Some of the numbers, some of the data that we see from customers. Have I got a few minutes left? Yeah. Rock and roll. There we go. Rightio. All right. The technology number 1 and 2, which are on that left-hand side of that spectrum, that measure really from the alert space all the way through to when we have the unintended sleep. The benefits of those two technologies is because you're measuring when people are alert or not quite their freshest all the way through to about to fall asleep, is you get heaps of data. No one needs to fall asleep to get a single data point. And so what you then build up is an alertness profile. And as expected, when you take 100, 1,000, or 100,000 people and lump it all together, what you find is people's fatigue score is higher during nighttime hours, lower during daylight hours. The key point and the gap here is this is true for humans, generally speaking. This is what policies are made from. This is how conclusions are drawn. But a particular individual might have this reversed. I personally know from, I only did 16 weeks worth of night shift work driving haul trucks in a mine. And I found I was great on night shift and horrible on day work. And that's just because of some weird thing with my eyes and how light works. But my profile doesn't look quite like this. Everybody's different. And that's why the good thing that technology offers is you get these bulk insights into your business or an operational work group, but you get the specific insights into the human as well. How this translates, and this is from a 3PL contract provider in the South Gobi Desert in Mongolia. And what they found is most of their fatigue alarms, I think 71% of their fatigue risk alarms happen on night shift. But what this also shows is they have fatigue risk alarms at all hours of the day and night. And again, one of the gaps in the really important regulations that we have is they mandate how much we can sleep, or how much opportunity for sleep we should be allowed, how many hours we're allowed to work. But what they can't do is assess whether we did sleep, whether we did, and even if we did, was it good sleep? And even if we did sleep and it was good sleep, here's a factoid that will be easy to remember. Of the 66 common reasons for excess daytime fatigue, number 7 on the list is a non-symptomatic urinary tract infection. 9 out of all 10 urinary tract infections have no external symptoms whatsoever except excess daytime fatigue. Which is why a decent doctor, when you go there and say, I'm fatigued all the time, or you go there and say, this magic hat tells me I'm fatigued all the time, they really should take a urine test, a blood test, and a bunch of other tests. It's not time to go to the sleep apnea lab. There's a whole bunch of other things that need to happen first. When we're looking at those technology 1 and 2 that give early warning alerts to drivers, one of the things we know happens is because people eat the wedge of an apple or sit up straight, when they're not at risk yet, they're at risk of becoming at risk at an early warning. When something beeps at them, they do something. And this is data from 100 truck drivers operating at Grandview, Washington in the US. They found they were 88.8% effective at responding to an early warning well before they were at risk. But what they also found was as the months progressed, as they moved into this deployment, people got better. Their response to early warnings alert was more effective. Why? Again, the gap is not everything works for every person. So for me, it's green grapes. For some people, it's sitting up straight. For others, it's having a sip of water. But people work out what works for them because they're getting real-time feedback from technology. If we look at that number, that 88%, 93%, that effectiveness of actions at the early warning, what we find is if you generically break up every journey into 10 segments, that your ability to effectively respond to early warning alerts changes the further you get along the journey. And what we found, and this is a group of dedicated refrigerated grocery drivers out of Moberly, Missouri in the US, and they found that in the first 10% of every journey, I don't know how many tens of thousands of journeys this was, people were 100% effective at responding to early warnings. So you're 25 minutes into the drive, the technology tells you, hey, time to do something. They do something, 100% effective. Toward the end of the journey, and for a whole bunch of reasons, including, meh, what do I care, I'm almost there, 80% effective, those actions. So there's a bunch of reasons for this, and these are the sorts of insights technology can give us into our business. We also found that for this particular group, they were 30% more likely to get a fatigue risk alarm or a fatigue risk event if they were traveling less than 5 miles per hour, miles because it's the US. And what that was when they were stuck at traffic lights or queuing at a port, queuing at a terminal. And so that's just sitting there idling is really significantly increasing their fatigue risk. When people progress to a point of, hey, you're really fatigued now, it's time to do that more severe action, so maybe even think about pulling over. And this thing beeps at them. Because they're a fatigued person and now something's beeping at them, what happens is you wake up a little bit. And maybe that response is partly because something new just happened, but we also know in part where policies and procedures play a role. There's an anxiety response because now it's, damn it, I didn't do what I needed to do enough. Now the boss just got a text message or the control room just got an alarm. What we also found is that response, that immediate alertness increase to that fatigue risk alarm, again, this is going back to Grandview, Washington, improved over time. And again, it's because, thank you, people found out what works for them more. When you look at the hard numbers in just the space of 3 months, by doing the things like responding to early warning alerts, getting that alertness jolt from the fatigue alarm, and a business intervening, saying, hey, pull over time, you see some real dramatic reductions in the alarms. We find also, even for the good drivers, the ones who really hardly ever get fatigue alarms, they can have a bad week. And this was a driver who, on their street, they had a whole bunch of break-ins. He was a day work driver. And at night time, for about a week and a half, he got really terrible sleep because literally he was sleeping in the armchair with one hand on the shotgun because he thought it was going to happen to his house. And he was on no one's list. He was never one of the, he's in the fatigue group, but he had a bad week. And in this case, he had technology there, so when he got to a point of risk, it told him it's time to pull over. We find, I'll skip through the numbers, we find 4 to 7% of every workforce represents somewhere between 60 and 80% of total risk. And so one of the things technology highlights immediately is those are the people who not only need the help, but if you help those individuals, that's when you're going to get the greatest return on investment, the greatest bang for your buck. Whether it's teaching people to eat more broccoli, whether it's helping them get the right medical assessments, it doesn't matter what you do, that's the group that you'll identify quickly and hopefully have a process to help. I'm going to skip some of the other stuff you see, and I want to go to one particular one. In mining, when you start a shift, every supervisor anywhere in the world, no matter what language, they will say, if you feel tired, let me know. I'll get you on a break. Every driver leader, truck shift superintendent will always say, the rules are, if you're tired, pull over, stretch your legs, take a break, just let us know. And in mining, it's frowned upon, no one ever puts a hand up. In trucking, no one puts a hand up or no one says, I need a fatigue break, because then it's frowned upon. Because it doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter what you say, the load's still got to get there, and we can't have a service failure. One of the things that we've seen when you implement technology, it demystifies this weird thing we call fatigue. And it says, look, it happens all the time. We've got graphs now about it. And so what we see is a 1,184% increase in self-report of fatigue. I feel tired. I need a break. And that's where technology fills that gap and says, you start to see cultural change by virtue of the fact that you're not only measuring this thing, telling people about it, caring about them, but you're shining a spotlight on a real problem at the moment we know exists, but we only typically regulate with hours of service. So I think that's probably a good place to stop. Really appreciate the opportunity to say good day. Thanks.
Might have a time for one question. Well, thank you very much, Daniel, if there's no questions. We will have a quick stand and chat just to break the session a little bit before we keep going. We have been sitting here for an hour now or so. So if you'd like just to stand and chat or go out of the room quickly, we'll start in 5 minutes. Thank you. We could quickly go back to our places and we'll move along just to make sure that we meet the timelines. Our next speaker is Ferdy Kroon. Ferdy is the Risk and Compliance Manager at DeBruyn's Transport and has extensive knowledge of federal and state compliance and industrial relations, human resource management, safety, fatigue management and risk management generally. And Ferdy will speak to us today about working with transport providers. Thank you, Ferdy.
All right, ladies and gents, given that I'm a risk manager, you're probably wondering why I'm here today, given that I've got two regulators in the room, my general manager, and most importantly, my insurer. So I will try and stay in lane a little bit and try not to upset any of those aforementioned four people. Thank you for the opportunity. It's fantastic to talk to you about, if you like, some specific issues in the loading and unloading space. They apply today, and they apply every day that we load and unload at any client site, and they're not just for transport providers that are here, but they're actually for end users, consignors, consignees, and those that actually do operate with us on a day-to-day basis. The first dot point pretty much says it all. Forklift versus pedestrian, hands up if you've ever seen the pedestrian win. Over the years, we've had some bitter experiences in these areas, on both our own and on customers' sites. In the last 8 years, we've had 4 LTIs, not to mention numerous bumps, scrapes, and first aid issues. That said, with clear controls, and we're going to talk about those today, it's possible to reduce the likelihood of risk, and you will hear me use some risk assessment terminology today. Unfortunately, we are experiencing an increasing number of injuries and near misses on client sites, so I'm really keen to explore how we can work with our transport providers, how the industry, that is, works with our transport providers to minimise these. I know what many of you are saying, especially if you come from a risk background like me, isn't it a case of simple elimination? Well, yes and no. Yes, you can pretty much stop any pedestrian on the ground. But what it does do is it impacts upon the type of freight you handle. It impacts, if you like, on the type of relationship that you have with your transport provider and how you load a vehicle. And it also impacts very much in terms of productivity. So for us, we may need to move freight around the tray of a truck to facilitate onward delivery. We may need to restrain freight as it's loaded. And there's been numerous cases where we've been in that situation, we've had to choke something on before something else is loaded on. And therefore, your forklift operator or your crane operator, whoever it is that belongs to the client, needs to work closely with the driver. We may also need to move our load restraint gates, curtains, and all manner of things that actually keep our freight on board. So here are some simple control measures. I'm going to work through these with a series of photos very shortly. But there's some key takeaways. What are we dealing with? What sort of freight are we dealing with? And you'll see some photos about that very shortly. Have we established good communications between the forklift operator, or the plan operator as I like to call them, and the pedestrian on the ground? What is our exit strategy? And you'll see a good photo of that shortly. And how do we go about reinforcing good practice? Remember, human factors are always there, and good practice can only be reinforced to I suppose, address complacency and human factors. You'll see just a quick example there, and I like this particular diagram because what it does, and I'm going to use a bit of technology here, what it does is it gives us a risk assessment mentality for how we manage plant on the ground and pedestrian. So obviously you've got the red zones. But here, and you'll see some of these photos and some of these diagrams, this area is red as well. I don't like that. I like it being orange. Reason? Because in some freight scenarios and in some, if you like, not containerised, but some of those smaller palletised situations, this area could be risk-free. What some operators do though, and if you like, some clients, they'll make it all red, in which case you start to restrict how your risk operation is working. And you'll see photos again very shortly. This area here, absolute no-brainer. Don't go anywhere between the forklift, the truck, and on the other side. Why? Because freight pushes through. How? Very easily, and I've got a good photo on that one later as well. Interestingly, I just had an incident a couple of weeks ago where one of my operators, one of my drivers, pedestrian on the ground, was putting some dunnage down in this point here. Dunnage as in timber. There was a long piece of, I think it was steel at the time, being placed down. And what happened was it rolled off the tines just before he got out of harm's way and hit him right on the steel cap toe. Boot took the impact, no injury, apart from the fact he was hopping around a little bit, purely out of shock than anything else. So what we did was we conducted a quick risk assessment. Well, how could we do this job better? You've still got to put the dunnage down, because if you don't put the dunnage down, the steel goes on the ground and you can't pick it back up again. So you've got to put the dunnage down at some point and you've got to space it. But why not? And silly old risk manager had a look at it, like me. I said, why not drop the load down to about a foot off the ground, easy, put the park brake on in the forklift's not moving, and then attack it from each side. Oh, so we're no longer operating in front of the forklift, we're no longer operating in front of the load, we're safe, the forklift's not going anywhere, providing the forklift operator is talented, competent, knows what they're doing. All of a sudden you've got a safe scenario. And then you get out of harm's way. So, go back to green, or yellow, whatever the case might be. Things to be conscious about. Placing the driver in a designated marked box. Now, this really annoys me from both a risk perspective and also a fatigue perspective. And I've had this debate with many a steel supplier over the years. If you place someone in a marked box, whether you're going to be nice and give them a chair or not is up to you, but their fatigue's not being well managed. Why not pop them in the crib room out of harm's way? Oh, the response I quite often get is, well, hang on, what if they leave the crib room? My response, what if they leave the box? We've got to rely a little bit on common sense, but we've also got to help the driver manage his or her fatigue. So pop them in the crib room, give them directions, you don't come out, and we're going to go away and we're going to load your vehicle for you. Very simple, very straight to the point, elimination has been followed. Uninvited guests, remember your people at every single client site here, every single receiver site, every single site, your people are your best individuals for intercepting those that shouldn't be there. Empower your people, empower your plant operators to, dare I say it, put the forklift tines down, turn the fork off and go off and say to that individual concerned, what are you here for? What are you doing? Can I help you? There's the office, I'll take you over that way. Because remember, they are the most important people when it comes to, if you like, the chain in handling loading and unloading. Complacency, I've made mention of that as well. Human factors do creep into what we do. Zero tolerance. Remember, drugs and alcohol on any sort of loading, unloading site should be dealt with appropriately. But most importantly, ask us. If you're operating in the chain as a consign or in a consignee, and you want to know how we can work together, then please ask us. Because we've got a lot of years of experience in handling freight of different types and sizes, and we can talk about those options quite easily. Oops. All right, press the wrong button. Got it. Hang on, can we go back one? Beautiful. All right, as I said, some easy photos. Highly paid trucks and actors have been used. Okay, first of all, beautiful. This one's quite an easy one, and hopefully you can all see what we're dealing with. You've got an oversized freight scenario here, no one on the ground anywhere in Bull's Roar of that particular load. Okay, quite easy. Over here on the right, oversized freight again. There's no need for a pedestrian to be anywhere on the ground whilst handling this sort of stuff. Pedestrian might provide input, the driver if you like, wherever the pedestrian is, might provide input as to where they want it on the trailer, but that has to be done from a safe location. So they're pretty easy. We'll get into the complex ones. Now, quite often in our game, we handle mixed freight, which is this stuff, palletised. It's not going anywhere. It's, if you like, it's shrink wrapped to the pallet down the bottom there. Chances of that moving is pretty remote. But in the same truck, we've got oversized freight. So the risk assessment process that we would use here with our clients would be load this side first, remembering that the heavy weight is going to come in over the axles because we don't want mass dimension issues, otherwise the regulator's not going to be too happy with us. But we're going to be dealing with this side first and then we deal with this side. It's about working together and it's about load planning. I'm running out of time. Alrighty, this one's pretty quick. Again, oversized freight. But I do mention, and this one on the right we'll talk about in a minute, it's a good photo. This one here, oversized freight, but you've got things like load restraint curtains and poles. They need to be moved. So once again, before you start lifting up and putting in, let your driver move this gear for you. Otherwise, you're going to damage it. Here, you've got an open space, possibility of a driver working in there to actually open or close or load whilst the forklift's working over here because that person is safe. Photo on the right, if you all lean that way, nothing to see here. What I wanted to talk about here was working together as a planning team to get your load planning right. And also you've got what's called mezzanine decks up here, see? You can load on those, but quite often the forklift operator can't see that high. They're sitting down in a forklift. So they might need a guide, not standing here, not in underneath the mezz deck or on top of the mezz deck, but just to the right-hand side, guiding them in. Bit further, widen your tines, bit further. Bingo, got it, get out of harm's way. And that does happen, and it needs to happen when handling mezz deck freight. Here, load planning, remember don't put stuff too heavy further up, otherwise you end up with a trailer that looks a little bit out of whack. Finally, I said I had a good little photo for you. See this little piece here? This is where your load-unload exclusion zone stuff works. All right, you've got a good plan in place. If something does come off, rest assured, Mike, it was restrained initially. If it does come off because it's been nudged by a fork, that thing weighs about 2 tonne. It's come down, bang, and rolled all the way down there. No one in harm's way. No one's going to get hurt. Yep, made a hell of a lot of noise, but everyone's safe. And what it did do, though, was it actually encouraged us to review how this stuff was loaded and handled. And we now work with our client to develop a better system so it can't be nudged off the forklift. And again, takeaway point there, work with your transport provider because chances are we've got ways and means that we can work together to stop this sort of stuff from occurring. Finish with a little bit of blatant advertising and happy to take questions. Cool. I'm off the hook. Thank you.
Thank you, Bert. Our next speaker, Aidan Jamir, will cover common challenges and strategies to drive successful return to work programs for physical and psychological injury claims in the transport sector. Aidan is an accredited exercise physiologist who's experienced working in public and private health sectors before commencing a career as an occupational rehabilitation consultant. Thank you, Aidan.
Afternoon, just. All right, so I'm going to change the tone a little bit and talk about once you've had a workplace injury and how we can work through that together. The transport industry has some interesting challenges, but there's plenty of learnings across all different industries that we can learn from. Some of the pain points that you as individuals may have experienced and identify with, what it costs, how do we approach it as someone who works in return to work full time, and some of the tips and tricks and the way that we look at it. and how can you apply some of those to try and get some better return to work outcomes, reduce your claim costs, improve your productivity, etc. If we've got time, dive into a little bit of mental health as well. That may not be compensable, but with any injury there's some sort of mental health component, whether it's small or large. So you may identify with some of these next phrases. Research says some of the challenges that you may face as people working in the transport industry and other employers is finding suitable duties with someone who's injured can be a challenge, trying to understand certificates. How do you manage that and how's that affecting that individual? How do you look after yourself in some pretty complex environments? How do you set boundaries? How do you keep comp staff different than non-comp? How do you manage that employee if there's performance issues whilst they're on claim? How do you have a safe and sustainable return to work when someone's pretty keen to get back or does not want to go back? Balancing productivity, which we've spoken about today as well. Some of the different economic circumstances can be challenging, and how do you balance that with someone on claim? Ergonomic adaptations. Communication is one of the biggest barriers we'll see, and I'm sure many of you can identify. Trust can be challenging too. How do you trust the employee to tell you how they're actually going? How do you understand how that is intertwined with your insurance processes and work with your insurer and the legislation? Conflicts, someone's job's on the line, that could be a bit of a tricky situation, and telling the hard truths. I'm sure many of you have come across many of those challenges yourselves. For me in my work, as long as working with our colleagues, rehab management, these are the things we tend to see a lot of in the transport sector, is your back, shoulder, knee injuries, and some psychological injuries after some of the motor vehicle accidents we've spoken about before. How do you get that person back into the workplace is obviously often the biggest challenge. Once they're back, everything's a lot easier, but getting them back is usually the first step and the first big hurdle. How do you get them back into a vehicle? So if they've got to climb into a loco, or if they've got to climb into a truck, if they've got a knee or a shoulder injury, that's one of the first challenges you'll often find. Drivers often don't want to do stuff outside the scope that they're used to. They're used to getting in, doing the job. How do you have that conversation? What other duties could you provide them to get back into the workplace to fast track the process? And generally mental health is a bit of a tricky situation as well. Bit of an industry snapshot. There's some better data on your tables though, a little bit more up to date and state specific, so I'd encourage you to have a good look at that. But the number of injuries is coming down. However, the transport industry is a high risk industry, so you're overrepresented in the industry, industry rates, and fatalities are extremely high within the industry too. We often see a lot of sprains, strains and traumatic injuries to the muscle or soft tissues, and some interesting stuff there around cardiac conditions and that truck drivers, we've spoken a lot about sleep apnea or poor sleep. What's their general fitness like? If you've got someone who's got an injury and they're obviously not looking after themselves, that becomes a lot more challenging than someone who's fit and healthy as well. Some of the challenges that the drivers are facing, or other people that are working in that supply chain, time pressures, vehicle design, handling heavy weights, working at heights and gas and fume exposure. So if you're looking at costs, transport industry versus all industries, you can see there that generally they are higher, and they're significantly higher. So this is data that captures a significant injury, which is someone who has 1 week or more off work. So you're not your short-term ones, and you've got nearly 3 weeks longer on claim and an extra nearly 3K that it's going to cost to get that person back to work. If you're looking at mental health, those costs blow out and the timeframes blow out significantly as well. So they obviously have some really significant challenges associated with that. How do we approach the return to work? So if you're working with a rehab provider, they've got to have some sort of allied health background. So that brings a certain skill set with it. Return to work coordinator is slightly different. We're looking at a person, not just their physical injury or psychological injury, but how is all of the factors intertwining, because often what we find, what appears to be a simple back strain becomes a nightmare of a claim because of all these other factors. It's not usually that physical component that makes it challenging, it's the mental health, it's the social interactions, it's all those other pieces that makes that thing quite challenging. And when we're triaging a claim, or when we get a claim in early, we're looking for these flags. So we're looking at how complex we think that might be, what are the things that are going to make this more difficult than another claim, we're screening it with a tool something similar to this. So you've got your biological factors, which is generally your physical injury. The body's pretty good at healing itself. There's usually pretty clear guidelines on how long that should take, and that's pretty easy. But obviously, a broken leg versus someone who is often having back surgeries, two different time frames for their recovery. Whether that treatment is successful or not are the other mental health issues. The yellow flags is generally where we find most of our barriers are. So what is that person's perception or understanding of their injury? What is their perception of their recovery? How do they cope? And are they actively trying to recover, or are they waiting for everyone else to fix all their problems for them? Blue flags coming more into a social environment. What's their dynamic like at work? What's their support networks like? Do they enjoy their job? Do they have... is there a sense of injustice around how that injury happened? Is it someone else's fault? That is often one of the really big early signs that this is going to be a difficult process. And black flag, looking more at the financial side of things. If someone's going to be making a higher comp wage than they would normally, you've usually got a problem on your hand. How do you get that person back to make sure they're back into the workforce and not costing you anything extra than you have to? These are evidence-based principles, and these is what I find the factors that really help a return to work come along nicely. We've talked about it all morning. What's the health and safety culture around that workplace? Has a big impact. If someone's perception is they're going to be pushed back into the workplace and they're going to end up re-injured, that's going to make it more challenging. Can you provide suitable duties? If we're trying to get someone back to fully fit to get them back into the workplace, the timeframes are going to blow out massively, because if we're coordinating a successful return to work, you've got treatment working in parallel with their duties, their work hardening as they recover with their treatment providers, you're going to get a lot quicker recovery. Do you have a supervisor or a return to work coordinator who's familiar with the process? They're a single point of contact. They know how to try and streamline everything. If that person has had an injury and their doctor's written them an initial incapacity certificate, do they hear from their supervisor or someone at the workplace quickly, or are they left for a month and they haven't heard anything? You'd be surprised how many times we hear that across lots of different employers and sectors, that someone's had an injury, we're brought on by an insurer and they're going, I haven't heard from work since this happened. Straight away, that breaks down relationships. That's going to make it a lot more challenging. So something as simple as a phone call can make a really big difference in how well someone's return to work process is coordinated. What's the communication pathway like? You've got your doctors, they can have their challenges. You've got your treaters, they can have their challenges. How are they all communicating? Is everyone on the same page? Often we find that if you've got a set of expectations that are different to what the doctor's expectations are, which is different to what that injured person's expectations are, we're going to have a really hard time trying to get this to go smoothly. And is the person getting the right support at the right time? Of those 8 principles, 7 are ones that you have a fair bit of control over. We know that people who are off work for a long time have poorer outcomes than those who get back into work or stay at work post-injury. So you can see that those percentages drop quite quickly. And if you've got a 35% chance of a return to work, that's probably going to be a pretty expensive and a pretty long claim, and that's unfortunately may expect your premiums coming into the next renewal period, but speak to your broker about that. In terms of employer strategies, breaking it down to some simple take-home points. With a physical injury, have you got someone who knows how the process works? Do they know the paperwork? Do they know how to communicate with your insurer and how to try and get everything ticking along? Have you got identified suitable duties ready to go? So we're not going, all right, we've got capacity, and then it takes a couple of weeks to get the ball rolling to get someone back into the workplace. Using tips and tricks, using tools like suitable duties registers, job dictionaries, documents that you can get made up by someone. Rehab providers can do those as well. So it's easy to communicate what the physical demands are for those tasks, and it's easy to make sure that you've got people back engaged in the workplace. And if you're a larger employer, have you spent the time or taken up the chance to meet with a doctor and have a single point of contact there, so someone who identifies and knows your workplace and can help promote a return to work? Do you have physiotherapists, or are you using any sort of early intervention processes to try and reduce the risk of something going to claim or taking a long time if someone's got a few aches and pains? And mental health, again, awareness is a big piece. It's across all the media. Everyone is knowing that mental health is becoming a lot more prevalent and the awareness around it, but how do you manage that is a separate challenge, in knowing how to have those conversations and to work with those people. As I said before, there's always a mental health component, whether it's tiny or large, but often the claims that go really poorly are the ones where the mental health is the primary barrier when it's been a physical injury. This is an example of a suitable duties register I have knocked up for a transport business. Just an easy way for them to communicate with their GP around, all right, these are the duties. If you've got restrictions, this is a no-go, or it depends on the scenario. Something like that can be an easy way just to look after your return to work in-house for those more straightforward claims. Mental health. They're tricky at the end of the day. They're uncomfortable. You can't see the injury. It's hard to know what they're going through. Claims are often disputed. There's HR processes built in a lot of the time, and if they are accepted claims, they're usually long and they cost a lot of money, and they've got a lot worse outcomes of helping that person get back to work. For you, straight away, the initial barrier that we see is when someone is lodging a psychological injury claim. Usually there is a level of blame or perceived wrongdoing. Whether it's real or imagined, that's the nature of it. That strains relationships and that strains communication channels. It makes it really hard. Mental health is often a lot cagier in terms of communicating with your mental health professionals. If someone's going to see a psychologist, it's a lot harder to see how they're going and speak with them versus someone who's seeing a physio. There's different stigma around the release of information that can become a lot more challenging, and you can find that they almost take the side of the worker, which makes it very hard to try and get that person back into the workplace if they're coming from a position that the employer's in the wrong. And it's hard to know what is the work-relatedness of that mental health condition. Has there a pre-existing condition? How does that tie into what happened or what they felt happened? All these complexities make things a lot more challenging. Usually you'll find mental health conditions aren't just a single event. It's a build-up, it's lots of different things. If we're meeting with a person who's had a psychological injury and we're getting their history, it's not this happened, it's this, and it ends up, they drag it out for a long time. So it's usually an accumulation of events, and there's one thing that breaks the camel's back. Often, you won't often see the trauma side of things as much, but obviously working in the transport industry, if you've got a near miss or an accident, that's when that's going to become more relevant. In terms of understanding mental health, these are the sort of things that we tend to be looking at. It's your depression, bipolar, anxiety, panic, and PTSD are the common ones that we'll see. In terms of how does that impact on you as businesses within the transport sector, if you've got a higher prevalence of psychological conditions in the workplace, you're probably going to have a higher proportion of claims, you're going to have higher sick leave, higher stress levels, more HR issues. It's going to affect your productivity because people aren't at work or they're not engaged. It's going to be more challenging to keep those people within their job description and making sure they're doing their role well. And if there are issues, how do you work within those grievance processes? Or if it goes to claim, then how do you manage that if that's not necessarily a compensable condition? How can you apply that, or what can you take from that? Again, having someone who's trained really makes it a lot easier. If they know what to expect, they know how to go through the process. Often you'll find a bullying or harassment claim will be related to that person's direct supervisor. So then that makes the communication quite challenging. So having someone separate to that can make a really big difference in how well you can get someone back. Just so it's someone who's there's not that breakdown of relationship. What accommodations can you provide? Again, getting someone back into the workplace is a lot harder with a mental health condition versus a physical injury. So what accommodations can you make? It might be challenging short term, but it's really going to improve the chances of getting that person back into the workplace and getting that claim resolved quickly. Can you have some different reporting lines? Can you have them working from an alternate location in the short term just to help them get back into the workplace, or how can you negotiate some of their workloads to make sure that they're actually able to get back, get some runs on the board, and you can start to see some progress with that claim? Do you need to be engaging someone externally to facilitate a conversation around what that conflict point was? Using a mediator, get it sorted out early. Again, the longer that person's off work, the less chance you've got of getting them back to work and the more it's going to cost. And one of the common ones is, because you can't see it because there's often miscommunication around what's going on, it can be very frustrating for you as employers to understand what that person's going through or where the actual issue is. Don't express that to them, because that's only going to make things worse. If you're already, they're already vulnerable and you're finding that frustrating, that's not going to help the situation. And again, the more you can understand about your mental health and how that impacts the workplace, the better. We've spoken a couple of times today about culture, and it's particularly relevant for return to work and health and safety, as we've said. So what is the culture like within your workplace? How does that help promote an environment where you can get people back in quickly, and what factors may be impacting on that? At the end of the day, we all work in businesses, we need to make money, but how do you balance that with the other side of things? And research says that a supportive leadership structure, someone who understands what's going on, if you've got supervisors with good relationships with their direct reports, you've got a lot better chance of having that positive environment, and generally the culture at the top will flow down, so that can become a challenge as well if there's some pressures around that. Nearly done. Beautiful. So the stats around mental health. 1 in 5 Australians is going to have a mental health condition at some stage in their life. So it's not something that you're not going to see. You've got more than 5 employees, you're going to have some impact of mental health time back into the workplace. What can you do to try and get on top of that? Easy solutions can be, do you have an EAP provider? Something that's confidential, it's well known to the employees. If they've got their issues internally or externally, have they got someone to speak to? Can break down some of the stigma associated with that, and that can nip a lot of things in the bud. How can you provide some short-term accommodations if someone's got some mental health strains outside of the workplace that's going to help stop that snowballing and becoming a massive thing? And again, have you provided mental health awareness training or some sort of intervention or support to your managers so they know how to approach these situations and deal with these individuals? Again, we've spoken about that mental health is usually not one thing. It's multiple factors, and it's usually a lot of stuff coming from home, people bring it to work, and how do you recognise those signs or symptoms? How do you get on top of that? How do you support an individual through some of those tricky circumstances like you might see there, but keep it separate from their work performance? Again, how do you pick up on these signs? These are some of the classic signs and symptoms of someone who is starting to struggle with their mental health. And if you don't know that individual, it's going to become quite hard to pick up on those things. Some are quite nuanced, so having those good relationships can be key. If you're noticing these signs, how do you deal with it? Calling someone out in front of all their colleagues is probably not going to go down real well, so how can you pull that person aside? Can you have a nice quiet space to chat and just be empathetic and see what's going on in their world? You'll be surprised how much that'll make a difference to someone's perception of their employer and how they're struggling at work. If someone's shown a little bit of concern enough, and that can often be enough just to help people tick along and get through their stuff outside of work. Have you got other supports that can be provided if you're recognising that's something outside of your scope? Again, EAP can be really important. Modified return to work arrangements, whether it's comp or non-comp, and do you need someone externally like a rehab provider to try and manage that, to try and keep yourself separate and to sort of gain some of that appropriate medical information to tie everything back in. Something like an EAP program can be used by the employee or their family members. Again, it can be something that's really effective in helping someone through that. Some of the problems and solutions you may face with people opening up about their mental health. Someone doesn't usually want to admit they're struggling. That can be a big step for a lot of people. We've got a very high proportion of males working in the transport industry. Males and mental health, again, has its own challenges. How can you keep that conversation on that employee to structure around support? It may take a couple of times that you'll get there and you'll get to the bottom of what's going on.
If they're not willing to chat about it, but you're noticing there's issues, are you keeping good HR records? Are you documenting that? Because if something pops up, that can become your best friend down the track. If they're becoming aggressive or they don't want to talk about it, again, try and separate that. Bring in your relevant HR processes. You do have obligations to look after your employees at work, and your employees have obligations to look after themselves. So they're taken from the WHS Act. Your employees need to be taking reasonable care and following reasonable instructions. Your responsibilities to provide guidance around that. If they've not had training around it, that can become a tricky situation. How do you fulfil your obligations? Use your HR staff and make sure that your WH&S policies are well known about. And I will go to the final slide being, what are the take-home messages? You as your employees or people within the transport sector have a massive role to play in your employees' health and wellbeing. Most of us will spend more time at work than we do with our families. So you have a big impact on someone's overall health and wellbeing. I've outlined some strategies in the earlier slides to try and get on top of things. If you've got that good positive culture, you're going to improve your injury and illness incidences, staff retention, morale, productivity, and your return to work outcomes. If things become too hard, stick your hand up, get someone like a rehab provider involved just to try and help you through that process. Thank you.
Any questions? Just might be time for one quick. No? Okay, very good. So we're now on to our final speaker. And this is an update or review from WorkSafe Tasmania from Matt McLean. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak today. My name is Matt. I'm the Acting Regional Team Leader for the Inspectorate based here in the north of the state. What I'm going to talk about today just reinforces what everyone else has spoken on stage here. So I think the stats that we're seeing now really supports the programs that have been put in place, and that we need to continue to work hard to ensure that we're safe at work. So talk about the priority industries and causes, focus areas and trends, some statistics, and where the focus lies with the inspectorate across the state. So part of the strategic plan for WorkSafe for 2018 for 2023, we developed some strategies that we need to implement to make sure that we're fulfilling our promise to the community. And one of those strategies includes a focus on targeted harm. So this is the priorities you'll see. There's about 8 industries across the state that are going to receive some attention from us. And based on the stats, road transport is one that rates in that. Priority conditions and their causes, we generally see the 6 that are listed here. We'll see them right across most industries in the state, but they do vary up and down. Trends, so transport, postal and warehousing. It's the 10th largest industry of the 19 that are here in the state. Is that of a shock to anyone in the room? Did we thought it was a bigger industry or smaller? Undecided? Yep. So it accounts for about 5% total of employment throughout the state. So around about 11,000 workers, and that obviously goes up and down. We saw some updated figures of that earlier today, so it's probably around about 12,000 mark. Has a considerable proportion of full-time workers, so 74% of workers in the industry are employed on a full-time basis. The average across the state is around about 63%, so it's quite a high proportion. Over half, or 63% of the Tasmanian workers in the industry are of age of 45 years and older. It's 20% higher than all the other industries in the state. It has the highest proportion of serious injuries in Tasmania, 45% serious as a proportion to all injuries across the state. It also accounts for the highest number of fatalities amongst all industries across the state as well. Accounts for 28% of all within the state. And it's the 5th highest for injury frequency rate in the state as well. And road freight transport recorded the highest number of serious injuries, 55% of all serious injuries across the last 10 years. So 2018, there's 329 reported injuries, has 8th highest out of the 19. We have seen a reduction of 25% over the past 10 years. So it is trending down. Around about 2014, 2015, we've seen the reduction, but it also accounted for the downturn in economy across the state. We're now seeing employment across the state increasing. It's come up about 4%, so obviously without the trends, we'll see some more injuries come through as well. There's been 24 fatalities in the last 10 years across the state. Do you think that's a number we should accept? No, so we should be aiming for 0 across the state. That's quite high compared to some of the other industries, agriculture, construction and retail trade, so it's significantly higher. Body stressing is the most common cause of injury. It's 35% of injuries across the state, and the state average is normally about 36. Falls, trips and slips, and being hit by moving objects account for the main source of injuries after that. Vehicle accidents account for a further 9%. Now, a serious injury, that's rated as an injury that has required the worker to have at least a week off work as a result of the injury. So numbers of that are quite high as well. And once again, we see the 4 main factors again, so body stressing, slips, trips and falls, being hit by moving objects and vehicle accidents. So inspectorate focus, there's lots of branches within WorkSafe itself. We all work towards the common goal, but we go about our work a little bit differently. So we achieve change through compliance. We're ensuring that workplaces comply with their legal obligations, and in this sector it's probably quite hard because there's obviously need to comply to road rules, vehicle regulators, and then there's the work health and safety side as well. So it's quite a challenging industry across the board for that. The main legislation that we work with is the Work Health and Safety Act and regs, the Workers Rehab and Compacts, and the Long Service Leaves. That's predominantly where most of the inspectorate time is spent. So through compliance activities, all organisations and workers are engaged with and educated along through that process. We investigate complaints and notifiable incidents to determine if there's been any breaches to the Act. And also along that, we like to see root causes identified and any contributing factors to the incident have been established, and there's been controls put in place to make sure it doesn't occur again. And we also have a compliance plan, and that sets out the directive for the inspectorate for the next 12 months and the industries that we're going to target and how we go about that. So notifications received last year across WorkSafe, we had about 900 notifications come through to the north, about 1,900 to the south, and there's about 700 to the northwest. So it's a fairly big workload. If we split that up, we've received about 100 notifications in transport, postal and warehousing. And once again, the notifications are pretty much consistent with the stats that we saw with the main priority industries across the state. So where do inspectors spend their time? So the first graph here is in relation to response to no notifiable incidents and complaints. So construction rate's quite high there. We're looking around about 200 site visits in the transport sector. From a proactive point of view, this is where we go into the workplace to deliver a program. We're around about 100 attendances in that spot there. So obviously you do see a bit of a downturn with our attendance, and that comes from the change in the economy. Our workload is increasing, our resources are decreasing, so that's a bit reflective in that there as well. So the main topics that we see out on site and gets addressed are the top 4, plant and structures. So plant normally involves forklifts, trucks, so anything that's a vehicle comes under plant. Structures, we do see concerns with such debunking station, hopper systems that staff need to climb up onto to access and work on. We see some issues around that. Traffic management, which was talked about here today, that's quite high, so the interaction with pedestrians and plants moving around the site. It's a very hard one to put controls in place with. You just can't say we're going to have an exclusion zone of 10 metres because therefore your site's going to pretty much close. So it's quite a hard one to work with. Forklift safety, that's the operation of forklifts. Is it being operated correctly, wearing seat belts, using forklifts in an area that's safe to use, not running sideways across ramps. I only went to a site last month where I observed a worker not using a seatbelt on a forklift. Then, unbeknownst to him, he then put a pallet on the forklift, put a person on the pallet and lifted the person about 3 metres in the air. So this stuff still does go on. And safety management systems, this is where we tend to find some gaps. A lot of time is spent making sure that vehicles are compliant with the road rules, and sometimes it get missed how that mingles in with work health and safety. Safety. So that's where we identify some gaps there. Snapshots that were spoken about earlier on today, really great tool. I recommend that you download those, take the ones that are here today. This was released, I believe, about 3 weeks ago. I've only had a quick read of it myself over the past few days. So it was developed by the Work Health and Safety Regulators and the National Road Regulators, and it talks about how you can implement your work health and safety systems, combining with your activities with being compliant with the road regulator, so trying to bridge that gap. It's a 52-page document, and I recommend that you read that. And the Work Health and Safety Advisory Service, has anyone heard of the Advisory Service here before? Who have used it? Yep, if you have, yep. So really good service. It's a free service offered by WorkSafe Tasmania. There's advisors across the state. They're very skilled in lots of industries. They can come onto your site, provide information, sit down with the workers. They can do talks at the site. The biggest thing is the service is free and it's a confidential service. So if they identify any breaches to legislation on the site, they don't come back to the inspectorate and tell us about that. It purely stays with them. So it's a very confidential service. If you want to request a visit from the advisory service, you can go onto the WorkSafe Tasmania website, or you can ring the 1300 number there on site. That's all I had for today.
Any questions at all? No? Thank you, Matt. Thank you. So, it's been a whirlwind tour through some fascinating topics and interesting information, so I hope you've enjoyed today's Better Work Tasmania networking session, number 21. I'm conscious that we're just about dead on and just slightly over time now, so I'd like to thank you all for attending today, also for our live stream participants. Another 40 people or so were watching online today, and hope to see you at further events. Our next Better Work Tas networking session will be for the retail sector. We'll probably be running a session also around mental health around September, and then that will lead on, of course, to WorkSafe month in October. And this year we will be having a one-day expo in Launceston, followed and with other events over the month. So please keep your eyes posted for that on the WorkSafe Tasmania website. And again, please join Better Work Tasmania to get information about events like this today. You'll also note, as well as the other information on the tables, there is a Better Work Tas guidance booklet on managing an ageing workforce, because I know that's highly relevant to your sector from what's been spoken about today. So thank you again. Safe journey home. Thank you.